Sustainability can often seem like a depressing catalog of doom and gloom. But although we face serious challenges, a better and more sustainable future is possible. Welcome to Sustainable Planet.
Welcome to this episode of Sustainable Planet. I'm political scientist Kimberly Weir, and my co-host is Jordan Dye, a guy who knows an awful lot about sustainability issues. Outer space probably isn't the first thing that comes to mind as a sustainability issue, but preserving space matters in more ways than we might think, and not just about space travel. Though, Jordan, I am always curious whenever I talk about space to know who's interested in traveling to outer space. Would you like rocket to Mars or visit the moon?
Kimberly, there is not enough amount of money or genie wishes that could be given to me to strap myself to a giant fuel canister and light it on fire. I think it is an amazing thing. It's captured my imagination since childhood, but I've just always known I wouldn't be that person. And in some ways, I thought about it growing up as like the people who got on the boats and went across, but just to an actual environment we know doesn't want us. And so like, I don't think I would have been one of the people getting on a boat and trying a new world. I definitely know I'm not going to a new outer world.
My limit's definitely an airplane. And even still, every time I get in an airplane, I think about, oh my gosh, I'm in a can flying across the sky, right? And Michael is all for space travel. And I keep saying, Michael, you are on your own, dude. There is no way you're getting me out of the stratosphere. No way.
No. And like even some of like the still technically planes, but they're getting up above what's called and into the stratosphere. It's like, no, I mean, at the end of the day, I do fly a lot for work. And every time I used to be very afraid of flying actually in heights. And it got better with the amount of travel I have to do. But at some point during every plane ride, my brain is just like, humans don't have the ability or means to actually do this. You are flying through the air and this is ridiculous.
Yeah, I'm not actually afraid of flying, which is the strange thing. But the idea of actually going further out, just somehow, it's all of those movies of where you see people floating around in space and they're just like going to die because they're not tethered anymore or whatever. And also what brings us to our sustainability issue here is the fact that there's so much space junk out in space, not to mention all of the satellites and so forth that's out there that we actually need, that we're actively using, but a lot of defunct spacecraft biddies out there. And that's the scary thing, because if you are out there and you're in a suit and you get punctured by the fraction of a paint chip because of the speed that it's moving, you're dead, right? Like that just terrifies me.
Yeah, there's nothing you can do. You're not getting back in. No, and I think we really underestimate the amount of space junk. And really, to some degree, just the luck that we're relying on at this point that it won't have massive problems. And I'm sure we'll get into some of the international relation issues that are being caused right now by private space company junk.
Well, not even just that, but also to your point about where, space junk and how it got out there is, so it's because humans been sending rockets and things, even like kids now, elementary school, sending out cube bots, like they can send them out and track them and so forth. And I read this thing about, I forget the name of the company that Twitter now X started, where you could actually,
yes.
Did you know this? Where you can basically adopt a piece of space junk and you can tweet it back and forth. And I'm like, I don't know that it's still active, but I'm like, oh, please. Sorry.
I mean, it is. I feel like we are definitely in the 21st century when we have memeified garbage. I think that's probably a good descriptor of the 21st century in some way.
Yeah, I agree on that point.
But
yeah,
I think the thing when I was thinking about this is it's interesting because it's not an easy just stop doing that, right? And I think as putting this together and talking it through with some people, a lot of people immediately went to, well, we should just stop those space flights for rich people, and they thought about the kind of. And I had to point out that that's actually not really happening yet. I mean, it's going to grow and it'll be a problem. But what we're talking about today and the legacy of it is the activity that has set up our modern world. I mean, there's not a person listening to this podcast right now that isn't using a satellite in some way to listen to this podcast.
And that's the thing, is a lot of people say, we have so many environmental issues here on Earth to worry about. Why should we even care about what's going on with outer space? But the thing is that more space junk in space means more potential disruptions in our daily lives in so much more of a direct way than what the potential of an asteroid hitting Earth even. I mean, like, yeah, that could happen. And there are all sorts of space things that are going on programs to try to contain that and, watch movies, right? If you want to know more about these things. But when it comes to this space junk, this is like internet access, GPS coordinates, even processing credit card information. Like, you buy something, it's down, the network's down. And so these are things that have become such an integral part of our lives. People who don't even carry cash anymore. Like I usually, if I have $20 on me, like if anybody ever mugs me, they're going to be like really, really sad to find out what measly amount of cash I have on me that they've mugged me for. It's just
Sorry, I was just gonna say, even in far-flung aspects of our life, like one of the things I have a weird, odd obsession right now with potentially hiking the Appalachian Trail as a through hike. Can you can't really face it. Yes. But I think even there, people who love outdoor activities and are spending their time in the woods, spending months at a time, are relying on a GPS device to be able to know where they are, to contact their family. So I think that it is an interesting thing that it is in every aspect of modern life.
I have a lot of respect for people who still use compasses and can navigate by like the stars or something. I only very recently started using GPS for hiking. And it was a good thing I did the last time I went off on my own, because I absolutely ended up needing it. I didn't turn it on really until I needed it. And I did actually need it. I mean, I would have found my way back because invariably I have that sort of luck, but it was later in the day and I didn't want my family, Michael, and so forth to worry. And so I was like, no, I really glad I used this, because it still ended up taking me like 2 hours longer than I thought it would.
I love the calculus there. I know I could get back by tomorrow, but they would really worry.
That's exactly it. And so all of these things in our lives that are now just an integral part of our lives, and especially young people who never knew what it was like to not have a smartphone. Like, this is something this is the reality of what dangers and inconveniences that all of this space debris can actually cause us. And so it's not just about rocket ships going out. And I mean, also, and okay, yeah, there's also the life and safety of the people on the International Space Station who we have to worry about. And of course, they matter too. But we're talking about, like, I don't know, 3 to 5 people. I don't know how many people are out there at any given time. It's not very many,
Yeah.
I know.
In fact, I think that the max because you have, well, I didn't look into this for this because I know the Russian ended their partnership, so I don't actually know what happened there. But yeah, it was 5 to max 8 people.
So it's up to 8. Yeah, I know. It wasn't
when you have the version.
Right. Okay. Yeah. And so, and they do lots of amazing research and stuff that's been very useful to us, right? And all the monitoring, so forth, that they do. But even that, barring that, every day our lives will be radically changed if something happens. So, there's this concern about the Kessler syndrome, which is that you've got space junk. And I guess I should detail what actually constitutes space junk. We should start with that probably first before we get into Kessler syndrome.
Well, there's one more thing I want to add. And so I want to anchor this a bit, because I actually, in talking this through, some people made why don't we just stop or limit it, right? And we were talking today, we've used cell phones and some of those conveniences. And I know a common pushback against that is, well, that's a first world thing. So we're killing the planet for you again.
But it's not. But it's not exactly. Actually, because every place I ever traveled, I'm always amazed at the outer reaches of the most remote villages I've been. People, they're not smartphones, but they absolutely have cell phones, and they are absolutely far more dependent on satellite and so forth than what we are, where we're a lot of times have the fiber optic connections.
Exactly. And so when you talk about micro-processing banking payments and stuff in some of the developing nations that changed financial access, that's enabled by satellites. Even in work I do in other areas of my life, like the ability to track actual methane emissions or get to an actual measuring carbon concentration through satellites so that we know where our actual budget is. These are all being enabled by these technologies. So just as we went into this today, I wanted to kind of anchor people in that there is reasons we need this. So we have to deal with the problem. To your point, why are we talking about space when we've got enough on Earth?
Yeah. And so when it comes to space debris, we're talking about the actual working satellites. They're not debris yet, but so many of them aren't. There's a lot of work still to be done in being able to repair satellites in space and prolong the lifespan of them. And so we've got those, but there are a lot of defunct satellites that are out there that have been floating around for decades now. And then also, for the stupidest things, and this is something from an international relations perspective that was under the guise that China was doing this. So China blew up a weather satellite in 2007. And they did this under the guise of, oh, we're going to see if this is an effective way. This was the pretense of, oh, this is an effective way to actually just get rid of space junk. And I am fairly certain that they knew that this was not at all what was actually going on. And they were just doing this as a weapons test. I really do, right? I just don't buy that. And it ended up being to this day, from 2007, the single largest source of debris, where there were 3,300 fragments larger than golf balls and 150,000 debris particles that this one explosion of this one weather satellite caused. And then Russia, under Putin, decided that they were going to do something similarly stupid in 2021. Again, they're like, oh, no, we're just going to see if this new version works. No, it's not going to work. We already know this. And they blast an orbiting satellite rocket into a gazillion fragments, adding even more space junk. Not as much as the Chinese one did, but still. And
take some time.
Yeah, all right. And so we also have jettisoned parts from rocket ships of going up. And anything that anyone in the space station or anyone who was ever in space, if they lost a hammer or a screwdriver went floating out into space, it's gone. That's now space junk, and it's in this orbit of space junk. Even tiny things like screws, these things move at such a high speed that makes even a tiny screw, the space, it can push a satellite off course. It can actually put holes in the space station. So these are really scary things we're talking about. I mean, especially if you're the person out there.
Yeah, well, and that's just the debris problem, and I think that the debris is the symptom of the fact of how much we're putting up there. I think China's actions are a little, I don't want to say funny, it's not the right word, but in 2021, two SpaceX satellites had a 4-kilometer near miss with a Chinese satellite, which again they're functioning satellites, but it's the same principle as what we're doing with debris. And China made a very large issue of this and reminded the U.S. government that under international treaties, SpaceX isn't responsible for this. The U.S. government is responsible for those actions. And so I think I found it a little disingenuous, where at the exact same time China was taking actions that, because I can't speak with certainty and I have no knowledge of this, but I would be certain that China wouldn't be jumping to take any responsibility for that debris hitting something.
Yeah. And so back to the Kessler syndrome that I had mentioned, this is this idea or this theory that it's basically domino effect. You have these collisions and it could cause this massive wide scale domino effect across all of lower Earth orbit, which is called LEO. So the lower Earth orbit, where all of these things are satellites and so forth are going around, and it would basically make space inaccessible because it would end up just being like ping pong, like things just pinging all over the place with no predictability.
And the mental analogy I imagine for that is walking through a cloud of flies. You can see the space through it and they're really tiny, but you can't get through without them hitting you. And I think that was the mental image that came of the Kessler effect as it starts expanding, is that there's just not a way at that point to then penetrate what is basically a shield of junk.
Yes. And so we worry then about this whole network of satellites. And now they're sending out, various companies are sending out satellite constellations. So they are absolutely need to be connected in order to actually function properly. So that adds that added, it's not just one now that we're worried about, it's a whole constellation that has to be in sync, moving about. And if that goes haywire, then that's going to cause problems immediately as well.
Yeah, well, and then that's the point of adding. The more we add into it, the more you got the space junk and you got the stuff we're putting up there, and it's the domino effect happens between the collision of the two, right? And I think that some of these satellite clusters are talking about thousands of satellites being added per year, and smaller size, and that's great in there. But you start getting to the point of we think about it as vast emptiness, but there are actual limits to what we can put inside the stratosphere, inside the troposphere, and it was really interesting to see how quick we're actually approaching a problem here in the amount of space junk versus the amount of stuff we want to put in there.
And going back to your point about SpaceX collision with Chinese satellites and responsibility, that's a big part of the issue here is who would be culpable, who is responsible. Space is a common goods issue. And so nobody owns space. I mean, countries control space above their airspace, above their countries, but only a certain amount of miles out, kilometers or miles out. But when there have been attempts to lay claims to outer space, but that's not going to work. I mean, we have international waters in the oceans, and nobody is able to control any of those and really be accountable. And that's the thing with, so these satellites started going out, and it was companies who were doing it, it was governments who were doing it, but nobody was ever responsible for actually cleaning up the waste that's out there. And then, so we've got that, which we'll talk a bit more about, but also going back to one of the problems about having all of this debris floating around in lower Earth atmosphere is that we've got also the issue with waste falling back into the atmosphere from space.
You mean the junk doesn't just stay out where we put it? It's not just not our problem anymore?
Yeah, right. And that's it. They actually do. So what I've seen is that they can have like a junkyard that they can tow out to and try to, but then you have to actually have some company paying to move them to this sort of junkyard. And so, yeah, I guess that's the closest we can get to actually forgetting about it. But most of it doesn't even get that far, right? So it's in the LEO orbit. And so I guess that's a little redundantly since low Earth orbit is that. But I like the LEO acronym for some reason. I'm really fond of it.
Nice, yeah.
So it doesn't necessarily, so you send out a rocket and then you've got parts falling off. And so depending on when that was launched, if there are any changes, it might end up actually not falling in the 70% of ocean that covers the planet, but actually falling on land. And when it does, almost invariably, it's going to end up in a developing country because of the way that where the launches go, they're as close to the equator as possible. And so all of those countries that are on either side of the equator are almost invariably global south countries. And so where we've seen space junk falling, that's mostly where it's going. And they're not even the countries that are sending this stuff out there. Of course, they benefit from it, but most of them aren't the ones that are even thinking about rockets.
No, and we've talked about common problems and externalities, and as a through line in your show. And I think anybody in this space knows of like a seminal paper, The Tragedy of the Commons. I actually like to point to a paper that came out about 5 years after that called The Comedy of the Commons. And it was a slight rebuttal to the main premise, which was that commons are always destroyed. And in the Comedy of the Commons, the researcher, and I'm blanking on her name, I'll make sure that I get the link to Kimberly, though, because I think everybody should read it, pointed out that commons worked for hundreds and thousands of years when there were social restrictions on the commons. It was when the social restrictions got taken away and anybody could do whatever they wanted, that's when privatization worked. And I think this is a perfect example. As you noted, we can't do cultural kind of pressure on the international relations stage. We can't do it with waters, can't do it with atmosphere, and we certainly can't do it with space. So we're left with that tragedy of the commons. It is everybody's problem and no one's issue. And I think that's throughout the entire space issue, it just kept driving back to, there's not even a place where could we put the onus, right? Like, how do you incentivize that? And I think that when you're talking about like where it's falling again, they're not like the countries that are getting the debris or have the potential to are not the countries that are driving the space industry, that are pushing for the launch. They might, as we pointed out, benefit from activities from it, but it's really just it is an order of magnitude from who's causing the harm to who's dealing with the harm.
And whose lives are going to be most disrupted are not people in these global south countries, unless it's the debris that's falling on them. It's the people in the global north and the emerging economies who are going to feel it the more, right? They're going to feel the effects of that disruption much more readily. And I think that with tragedy of the commons and the common goods problem, though, is that with the space junk, like we need to do something about it. We all benefit from having these satellites out there, right? But no one is responsible for taking care of it. So how do we make anyone accountable? And this is problematic when we start talking about CO2 levels, because this is also something that now there are concerns that this is something that space junk and usage of space is also connected to climate change.
Mm-hmm. No, and I think that it's a really interesting problem with space activity because it's different than other emission sources. So I I think people can, easily look up how many tons come out when you're launching a space rocket. And just for you listeners who are interested, kerosene is the primary fuel. So you probably haven't heard of or thought of kerosene in your life in a long time. Most people aren't doing kerosene lamps, but it's not an advanced fuel. It's not a fuel that's got a lot of work into reducing the emissions. It is as close as you can get to let's just pump a fuel in there and light it on fire. And I get that, but it's actually not just the straight emissions. It's as that rocket's burning where these emissions are being released. Spaceflight is the only source of emissions that are emitted directly above the troposphere. Everything we do is at that lowest level of Earth's atmosphere. These are emitted above the troposphere into the stratospheric layer, which is driving a weakening of that upper atmosphere. But it's not just the upper atmosphere from the CO2 emissions, it's the soot and the particulates that are being released at that. So right now, there's about 1,000 tons of rocket soot emitted annually. Researchers at the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, I really wanted to say NOAA, but I tried for everybody. So researchers at NOAA looked at, well, what'll happen over the next 50 years as we are looking at a 10x increase in spaceflight. And so just isolating everything else, imagine emissions stayed the same. If it was just a 10x increase sustained for 50 years, that would lead to 10,000 tons of soot emitted annually, which alone, because of where it's emitted and the warming potential, that alone would drive a 0.5 to 2 degrees Celsius temperature increase. So to remove, we always talk about stuff in terms of carbon budgets and limiting to 1.5, 2 degrees. Spaceflight alone could be enough to push us beyond that. And even more important for me was actually its impact on the jet stream. So the emissions being released, and again, where they are at that accelerated pace, could lead to a 3.5% decrease in the global circulation of our jet stream, which is just, it sounds like such a small number, but like, it's really hard to explain to people that usually when we're looking at this, we're talking about this thing will do 0.1%, right? And it's the cumulative impact. So when you're talking about something with that much potential for harm, I think we have to address it.
And the thing is that for people who aren't familiar, haven't been around burning kerosene, it is dirty. It is like when you say soot, it is serious amounts. It smells bad. It gives off a lot of dirt. It is a very dirty burning fuel.
Yeah, and which is crazy because it's actually clean compared to what they were using originally, right? The Russians, the Soviets had a nickname, I believe it was like the devil's fuel, was what they called their original. And actually a lot of the ecological damage over the steppe region in northern China, Mongolia, is directly attributed to those early rocket launches burning this devil's fuel right above the ground. And we're still seeing the fallout from that.
So in addition to rocket fuel emissions, another problem with the CO2 and the emissions that are associated with space junk and so forth is that as we have more space junk, we end up having, this is connected to climate change because lower levels of CO2 emissions, increased levels of, it would be better to lower them. Yes, of course. Yes. Increased levels of CO2 in the lower Earth's atmosphere are lowering the density of the upper atmosphere. And the effect that this has then is that more space junk will actually make it through LEO because we've lost 21% of the cushion that used to be provided by the upper atmosphere. And so scientists predict that with rapidly rising, and the rate we're going, especially with recent political changes, CO2 level emissions, we could lose up to 80%. Of course, that they're going to say, "Oh, this is the worst case scenario," but 21% already. So it's not like nothing.
It's not out of the ballpark.
Yeah,
and we've already seen the story just that we can impact the upper atmosphere so easy, like the Kyoto Protocol and the Montreal protocols to stop that. So for people who are like 80%, that sounds hyperbolic. Not in the area we're talking about here. It's very realistic.
No, and so not only will more space junk make it through, but they calculate that 50 times more objects will actually survive into the actual Earth's atmosphere and make it through that barrier to come down and hit the planet because they would be burned up in reentry. But in this case, that's you lose that.
As a density, because the density is friction, essentially, which is heat. Yeah, I hadn't thought about that. Something we haven't, I guess, told listeners yet is how much this is increasing. So just for perspective for people, If you go back to the early 2010s, we had been averaging for a while around 70 flights per year, plus or minus 5 or 6. It was a pretty steady state. By 2018, that had already more than doubled over that 8-year period to 186. And again, we're at 263 launches for 2024, 60 launch increase between 2023 to 24. So essentially, and all projections, like I looked at some high end ones and I put those aside, but just the low level projections are that we will be adding the annual space flights from 2010 every year as an increase. So 60 to 70 extra flights adding in every year with a doubling period then of really, you're talking like 3-4 years as you're going. So this is rapidly happening, and the issues we're talking about today aren't slowing down.
And along with the debris that will return, right now it's 2,500 pieces, but this could go up to like 125,000. Like, that just was stuff that would be re-entering here. I'm not positive I've got those numbers right, but all these numbers just look scary to me when I look at anything that's like potentially re-entering and going to land on the planet. So I guess don't move toward the equator.
Yeah, I mean,
I don't mean to be flip. That sounds terrible. So I retract that.
Well, I mean, I'll be a little more flip for our next part of this, but like I've heard that, and actually I was going to make it a joke, but I do know somebody who has suggested it to me seriously multiple times. Well, Jordan, we've got these issues with garbage and pollution. Why don't we just ship it into the sun? The sun can burn it up.
My students would say that all the time. Why can't we just jet it out into space? It's the same reason. The reason why we can't do this is the same reason why we see just recently, very recently, that SpaceX flights, rockets had to be delayed because of schedule changes, because of having to worry about what they had to maneuver around in their flight path and so forth. And so on January 14th, then that meant that this was Australia, Qantas was delaying flights to South Africa because of these rockets. And then 2 days later, the SpaceX rocket actually broke up in space, and that caused a whole slew of flights to be redirected and delayed. And so when we talk about this, we're talking about like, okay, we can barely even get a rocket ship out there that was meant to go. Can you imagine loading this with a whole bunch of garbage and then have the blow up and like not even leave the Earth's atmosphere? What kind of disaster we would cause?
Well, and my answer is always, that sounds like a lot of work, a lot of cost just to not clean up our room. I don't know how else to say it, but it'd be like throwing it in my mind. It really is like throwing everything out and rebuying it every time because in your room instead of cleaning it. And I mean, I know there's an amazing note here that I forgot this until Kimberly sent this over, but it's the plot of Superman 4. And for those who don't know the original Supermans, you should stop after 2. 1 and 2 were pretty good. And then we don't need the rest. So
basically, you just told them this is the plot of Superman 4 and then just told them don't bother watching it.
Watching Superman 4, yes.
That's exactly the punchline anyway, which is they load garbage onto a rocket destined for the sun and it doesn't work.
Exactly.
Superman has to save the day.
And as far as I know, we don't have, I wish we had somebody who could come in and save it, but we're left with us. So are there solutions to this though?
Another thing that has actually been tested is the slingshot method, where the scientists have done this and projected like we could send garbage into space if we slingshot it, and actually then you're connecting onto orbits from different moving bodies that would actually do it. However, it's really risky and it's super inefficient. So again, it's back to there's got to be a cheaper, more direct way to deal with these issues than trying to say, well, our last ditch solution or our easiest solution, not even our last ditch like effort here to save the planet, but like, oh, we'll just do this now because this is easier.
Yeah, no, I think that it's a failure of imagination and we can deal with this. And again, we're going to get into this in hope, but I think that like some of these challenges of dealing with the stuff in space actually present interesting solutions to some of the challenges we have with waste on Earth. So I do think that there's a path forward in which we can leverage. I always like to say to my team and people I work with that the box is the problem space. And in this problem space, we have too much garbage. It's too expensive. We have garbage. So now, how do we fix that? Like that's where you get the cool creativity. Just saying, oh, we'll put the box aside and we'll send it to the sun, I find it is the lazy answer. And that's not what has driven forward our innovation.
Well, and there's the same way that there have been manufacturing companies that have actually thought about using the moon as a remedy to like dodge industrial damage to the Earth. And I mean, again, this is a completely impractical solution. And so we need to think, I like your box analogy here, that we are in the box. We are stuck in the box. We need to enjoy life in the box. What can we do to better enjoy life and preserve the box that we're in?
Exactly. And so when we look forward at solutions to space junk, as you said, there's options to move it out into a junkyard. There's some things we can do on how you design stuff to break up. I know about that. But is there anything that's been done on the international side of this?
Well, like ever, I feel like a broken record every time I talk about anything international relations, but we need government coordination for the use of outer space, like serious. And there were attempts by the United States years ago, the United States and the European Union, to try to coordinate the use of space, because one of the biggest concerns with space use, and that goes back to what we started talking about, my criticism of China, what China's actual motive was for blowing up a weapon or a weather station, was that the actual militarization of space. And so a lot of the policy that has come about the for regulating space usage has to do with military means, military uses, and limiting and controlling those, and what, anti-space missiles and weapon systems and so forth, and what countries can and can't do. And so now, though, because we've got this concern with space junk, and this is a real concern, now more of these policies are actually being laid out to include, and at least to try to address these issues. But unfortunately, we run into the same problems that we do with any sort of issue with dealing with Earth policies. Sovereign countries get to do whatever they want to. So they can choose to abide by this policy, even if they sign on to it, even if they're a member of the United Nations and they're supposed to follow these rules and can be held accountable by the United Nations and any legal body. It doesn't matter. They're going to do, like North Korea is a perfect example. They're just going to do whatever they want to do anyway, right? Russia invades Ukraine. Right now, we've got also the Rwandese in the Democratic Republic of Congo fighting and controlling various areas, trying to back the M23. You could tell the international relations persons in me still. Well,
I was going to say, sitting here as a Canadian on January 31st, 2024, or 2025, I could list other governments that are doing whatever they want. And but it is the core problem is self-interest. And it makes a lot of sense to me that the military angle is the thing that's gotten traction, right? Although it's surprising to me that the international agreements do assign commercial responsibility to the host country. I thought that was interesting, and I wanted to ask you, do you know examples of other areas where that's been done? Where the actual government is responsible for the activities of any private corporation in that area?
Not off the top of my head. Though international law is not my main area. Ask me economic questions and I can tell you.
It just seemed really novel to me. And so if there is anybody out there listening that has an international law and can send it, I'd love to see that. I like that NASA it has an actual plea on their website. And I came across this as well, right? And it was really interesting to see a U.S. government agency almost making a plea that I think could also be directed at the U.S. government as well.
Might be one of those that will be taken down soon, so we don't know. When I read NASA's plea, actually on their webpage, asking for countries to cooperate and reduce and reclaim space debris because it's such a problem for space and our daily lives, that I was actually transported back to, I would like to be teleported. That's what I would like. But I was teleported back to my international relations classes, talk about, wishful thinking here and hopeful futures. That would solve a lot of problems, though, right? You got to think that teleportation would solve a lot of problems.
Yes. Yeah. I mean, except for the philosophical one. Are you the same person?
And also, yes. But also then that would be the solution. We'll cause more problems probably, because then we will be jetting just garbage and people and all sorts of stuff. Who knows what will end up going out to space. So that's kind of I take that back, probably. Kind of scary.
Although we have a listener I know who listens to the podcast who just, as we talked about teleportation, just had their bingo card pulled out, which is free energy. We need the energy thing because that solves so many of the problems we end up talking about.
So the UN has actually done some concrete things toward mitigating space debris. So in 2018, they started to recognize, this is a problem. We should lay out some guidelines. There's UN resolution in 2021 with 6 additional resolutions in 2023, elaborating on the original 1967 Outer Space Treaty. Again, that was about countries consulting each other about what actions would potentially cause harmful interference, which most countries kind of ignore. But now this sort of idea of what can potentially cause harmful interference extends beyond we have weapons and we're shooting at you or we're shooting down your rockets. This is now we're talking about intercepting satellite anything information, disrupting satellite information and communications, and just how dependent governments, regardless of how poor the government is, governments everywhere are still very dependent on satellites for their daily operations.
Yeah. And when thinking about some of these collaboratives, at the end of the day, as you said, this requires government collaboration. And I think one of the things that is a sad reflection of our current time is that we're not moving towards more cooperation in space. We're actually moving away from cooperation in space.
But that just reflects what's going on the planet. I mean, planetary relations as well.
I mean, I'd say that, but I would also point out that, like, after the initial space race, even near the end of the Soviet Union, that space was an actual area. Like, after that initial competition, and we both get there, it was an area that the U.S. and the Soviet Union used as a bridge because it was. And I think back then it was different. It was outside of terrestrial concerns enough that it could be an area. And to your point, I think that Russia pulling out of the International Space Station and going towards a Chinese option for partnership reflects that space has become a terrestrial concern.
Yeah. Yeah. And so then, and here on planet Earth, too, in the United States, we've got the FCC, the communications, they care about what's going on. And the industry also adopted safety standards so that, again, the idea trying to have some level of accountability at the country level so that anyone sending out, and this is the direction I should also say that other countries are going to, that any business sending out satellites are then going to be responsible for dealing with them after they're defunct. And so any non-functioning satellites, then either burn it up in the atmosphere or do something, reclaim it, or send. There's a lot of really interesting business opportunities in terms of dealing with satellites that are out there and repairing in space and so forth. And so when it comes to these, the FCC is saying, hey, let's move in this direction. The European Union enacted a similar policy to minimize space debris and just unwanted garbage floating around. And it's also working on, as the European Union, as well as corporations, are working on active ways to remove debris. Japan has been doing the same thing. And so these are things that moving in that direction of, okay, so now countries are maybe starting to recognize we need to have some responsibility here. We need to also make parties who are sending this stuff out a bit more responsible because we are really going to run into some problems if we don't take care of space better.
Yeah, and I think the one thing I didn't find that I would expect to see soon is because this models how we typically handled industries on Earth, right? You do things, we find there are problems, and then we put reclamation standards in. Really weird that, we always add the reclamation standards well after there's a reclamation problem. And I think that that's what they're really moving to is kind of base reclamation standards for the space industry. And I think that one of the things there that I haven't seen, but I would expect as the next step that you typically see is an industry fund where you're paying into for any unprotected liabilities from companies that might go defunct. And I haven't seen that yet, but I would expect that at a minimum, that's something we will see in coming years, especially as more attention's put on this with the increase in commercial activity.
And we definitely see, right? Corporations are totally on board with this. First of all, they're the ones who have the deep pockets to be able to do this sort of research and move in that direction. And they also know they're going to be able to make some money off of this. I mean, this is seriously going to have a good return on their investment. Hate using ROI, but there it is, right? And so there is an incentive here. And some companies already, like SpaceX and Amazon, have argued and convinced the FCC that sending out more satellites is the way to solve this problem. I'm skeptical about this, right? The theory is that having these mega constellations that have been approved and are out there would actually help to sweep up dead satellites and debris in their path. I am not a physicist. I'm not an astrophysicist. So as much as I really enjoy reading theoretical physics, this is way outside the scope of what my brain can comprehend in terms of how this would actually work, because we keep talking about how space junk can disrupt all of this stuff. So how is that going to be trapped? That's for a different podcast to answer.
Yeah, for listeners, I can get into the deep technical weeds on synthetic fuels and chemical stuff, but I'm not gonna lie. I tried digging into this to talk a little bit more about it because I had the first same I scrunched my face when I saw it, and I couldn't get past a mental image of satellites with nets, and my brain was like, "That's not what they're talking about." So I had to. For interested listeners, please take a look at this. But I mean, companies that are going to say the thing we wanted to do is the thing that'll solve the problem is always a little suspect. But I do think that because of where we're at, if they can show and make a good case that this might work, we're at the try stuff phase, really, of this.
I have to say that the two companies that I've come across repeatedly that are sort of at the forefront of this, and they're working cooperatively on this, are Intelstat and Space Logistics. And the two of them have been doing things like trying to work on in-orbit repairs and in-orbit refuelings and inspections and assembly and manufacturing, also doing things so that it's in order to have a new satellite in orbit, it's not necessary to actually launch each individual satellite from space, which would right there alone would cut down on the debris and also all of the emissions that you'd mentioned earlier. So we have that. And so they're working on figuring out how to extend the lifespan of satellites and making repairs in space. And so this will help a lot. And then this also bolsters the whole industry of space flight too, because then you have more people who can go out into space and be very excited, unlike Jordan and me. Zero interest. We will not be the ones doing this, though. Michael might. And developed all sorts of types of vehicles and robotics and pods and so forth to actually try to do these things. And so this is something that I think is kind of hopeful because unfortunately, but fortunately, if there is an economic incentive to be had, somebody is going to try to work on it and solve this issue to take advantage of that.
No, and it directly gets to why I'm hopeful in this area today is people have probably heard of the concept of a circular economy in like an Earth kind of aspect. And it's great. And there's a lot of benefits. A circular economy in space is almost a necessity to sustain space, right? And sustainable in the sense that we can do it over and over and it's cost effective, not necessarily the environmental side. And so when I was thinking about this, because that's a raw material that's floating around in space at the end of the day.
Just like the gazillions of dollars worth of metals and bits that are out there that could be harvested. I mean, that's a lot of potential resources to be used.
Exactly. And then to your point, the cost of the resources are there and somebody else paid for it, right? You don't have to launch something up to get that back up there. The economic incentives for a circular economy and circular economy processes in space, I think, are just like one of the largest kind of drivers I've seen. When you look at like usually economic, you're like, if you're trying to make the case on sustainability, you got to really show people. This one is almost just a no-brainer, and we see the activity going that way. And why this makes me hopeful, and I got really excited for this part, was not just that I think that it'll reduce the space junk problem, but I actually think that we can see a leveling up of some of those same circular processes in Earth-based industrial processes. Because there's not as much of an incentive here to develop them because we have the resources are here, the cost, right? So I think that there might be an interesting interplay between developing it for space because it's a necessity to deal with some of these problems and make it sustainable. But then we end up actually benefiting long term because we can bring those processes back down to Earth.
And so whenever I think of these things, I think immediately two things come to mind. One is always apocalyptic films where people are out scavenging in space, right? All of the space pirates and so forth, because they know that there are all those resources out there that if they collect them, they're going to be worth something, right? So I think that the other thing I think of is the Apple series that was on recently, For All I Hate That It's Mankind, but that was the era. So I'll say For All Humankind, that where it is that they are actually setting up and working in space and using stuff in space and have actual work facilities set up in space. I mean, I don't think we're that close to that sort of thing, but collecting junk in space to reduce pollution and for potential resource, that reuse, that's something that is already there. Astroscale is a company that's been doing this for a while. they've had a few fits and starts with it. I think it's a Japanese company. And they've got projects going on, and they are trying to develop, and they're not the only ones trying to develop like arms, space arms. You were talking about net. It is basically like, from what I understand, where they put out arms with nets and basically just try to, it's like you would get, net up fish, the same sort of idea, just scoop them up. And so there are certainly attempts at this, that it's not something that hasn't already been in the works. This stuff's been in the works for as long as there have been the potential idea that satellites could do more than just die in space.
Mm-hmm. Well, I think that's also, we talked about the rapid scale up. I said from early 2010s, only 70 now to more than quadrupled over the last 15 years. The other problem of that is some of these other things, other processes take time to ramp up to that scale too. And it's the interplay between how quickly can we ramp up some of the stuff to mitigate harm versus how quickly are we ramping up the harm causing activity, right?
Well, and I think in this case, we talked about two bodies that have great incentive to do this, right? Two actors who have a great incentive. One are the corporations who can make money off of this. And second are certainly the governments, because they have real security, military and economic interest to protect. So there's an incentive for them to regulate, to encourage mitigating space junk, to encourage cooperation where possible. Right? All of this stuff has a much more tangible effect on climate change than climate change does. So this is something like, your phone's disrupted, you're going to know it. Yeah, if it's hot, you can turn up the air conditioner, right? But here's something where you're going to be very upset if you're out in the middle driving somewhere and you lose your GPS coordinates. And then most, people, I always ask my students, like, how many of you can read a map? And so some of them said, yeah. I said, how many of you have an actual physical paper map in your car? And I was like, an entirely different, like, I do, you do, but how many other people do, right? And so I think especially younger people, if they look at a map, they're probably like, those few geography heads like me who are like, oh, it's a map. Everybody else is just like their eyes glaze over and like, I wouldn't even.
Well, yeah, I've got it on Google.
That's right. Exactly. Why would I need this paper thing outdated? So, yeah, I think that there are in some ways, I kind of feel a little bit more hopeful on this. I just hope my hopefulness is that, can it be expeditious enough to actually save us in time from ourselves on this?
Yeah, and I think that's maybe the way I'd phrase it is, in a lot of the other cases we're talking about, we're showing substitutions, right, that are available and how we can switch it off. I'm more hopeful that we actually solve this one on a quicker timeline, because there isn't a substitution. There's not a do space flight in a different way. There's no teleport to space, essentially. So I think that in an interesting case, because this is the only option and because of the economic and military incentives, it seems almost like a perfect storm for an area that we could actually make some big impact on.
And let's hope that is in fact the case sooner than later. If you enjoyed our episode of Sustainable Planet, or even if you didn't, let us know at splanetpod@gmail.com. You think I'd know that by now. We're also on Facebook, Instagram, LinkedIn, and YouTube. You'll find these links in our show notes on our website at splanetpod.com, along with additional resources from today's episode. You can also read more in my Substack post, which I can't keep telling you all, they're so amazing. If you could take some time to, thank you. If you could take time to rate and review Sustainable Planet on your podcast app, that'd be awesome. I hope space debris did not interrupt this episode. Thanks for listening and have a sustainable day.